Howdy, folks. Welcome back to the farm. Today we'll be continuing our journey through John's strange vision as he receives the revelation on the island of Patmos, a tiny island in the eastern Mediterranean, around 94 AD. And as we've heard so far, it's a bit of a mess. The chronology is clearly iffy. There seems to be Quentin Tarantino-style storytelling going on, because we seem to be getting multiple glimpses of the same event, and it's uncertain that we're proceeding in a strict chronological order. Due to this, it would be very difficult to determine exactly how long this thlipsis, or tribulation, is supposed to last. John is going to give us some very specific time frames in this chapter. We heard one of those at the very end of the last volume on Revelation. And these numbers definitely give scholars a lot to wrestle with over the years. And unfortunately, in upcoming episodes, we will definitely have to deal with some of these numbers and some of the mathematical theories surrounding what these time intervals might mean and how we might be able to map those onto real historical events. But before we revisit these two fire-breathing prophets from the last episode, let's talk about Greek, Vincent's favorite subject. Let's talk about a few Greek words that are very important for our context. Words that come from ancient Greek into English through the Christian tradition. Words like apostasy and blasphemy. And, most important for us today, the words prophet and prophecy. So, let's get into it.
We're going down to ancient Greek grammar junction, where every word has a specific function. It ain't fun, it ain't sexy, it's not even all that interesting. But for some reason, Vincent is obsessed. So let's hear him out.
So let's start with the word apostasy. A-P-O-S-T-A-S-Y. And it just means to break away from, stand apart from, take a stand against. It's used for people who have left a faith or parted ways with a particular church or belief. The S-T-A-S-Y part of the word is related to stasis, which is a word that has entered English from Greek that you may have heard. It's related to the Latin word status, and it refers to standing or establishing or fixing something in place. Literally, taking a stand against, going over to the other side and standing firmly in that position is the image that the word is trying to evoke. And the apo part of the word apostasy just means apart from, away from. Now, blasphemy is built of two parts. The B-L-A-S part comes from an ancient Greek word that means to hurt or injure or attack. And the P-H-E-M-Y part, the thummy part of blasphemy, refers to speaking. It just means to say something out loud. And so blasphemy just means to speak ill of somebody, or to curse them, or to attack them with words. And in the ancient world, people believed in curses. They took them seriously in a way that we don't. You had actual businesses where people would pay money or trade items to have a specific curse, some particular group of highfalutin, ancient, or arcane words scratched carefully onto sheets of silver or copper or some other precious or unusual material, and they would be buried or burned or used in different ceremonies, and people paid money for this. We find curses written down in elaborate ways all over the place in archaeology. In one archaeology journal, I recall seeing a little decorated ceramic container clearly designed to hold some sort of medicine or household pharmacological product or beauty product. And the inscription states who the vial belongs to, and then proceeds to explain in very poetic terms that if anyone else uses that vial for any reason, may they go blind. So they took that stuff seriously. Now, this Phemy, the fummy part of blasphemy, we find that in other words too. Anytime you see an ancient Greek word where you see Phet, like fet, or Phat, fat, the hip-hop spelling of fat, and then Phesy or Phecy in words like emphatic, emphasize, blasphemy, prophecy, or prophet, or the verb prophesy. It all comes from the ancient Greek word that just means to speak, to say something out loud, to communicate. And it's related to the Latin word that we get the word fame from, or famous, meaning somebody is well known because people talk about them. Now, remember that the word in Latin, in certain cases can mean against. So, in Catilinam is the name of the speech that was directed against Catiline. And so this is the logic behind the word infamy, because if someone is infamous, that means that people are talking against them. And so that clears up that confusion, because people sometimes wonder about the difference between fame and infamy. It all depends on whether people like you. Now, we covered what the Phet in prophet comes from. Well, what about the pro? Does pro just mean that he's a professional speaker? Now, the ancient Greek prefix pro in this context means before or in front of. Now, a lot of people, including me, have taken this as a suggestion that part of the prophet's role is to predict the future, because we just said before or in front of. A prophet is someone who speaks before or says things in front of other things. And I think over time that has been an implication, but not an official one. The real official meaning of pro here is just to be standing before God. For example, the way an official interpreter might stand before a king during some tense negotiations with foreigners in court. And so it's really someone who speaks for God. And so they may not be speaking of the future all the time. It's just a matter of they have the authority to communicate or compile or interpret God's word in a way that normal people don't. Bear in mind that the Bible is not democratic at all. You have a few individuals who are given massive responsibilities and tremendous power, almost out of the blue, at least from the human perspective, while you have thousands or millions of other people with no power or voice whatsoever. It's a strange world. Now let's talk about a fourth Greek word that's pretty triggering, a word that has a lot of drama attached to it, a lot of death attached to it, especially in the Middle Ages. And that's a word that comes from ancient Greek, and that word is heresy. Heresy. Now, I don't mean heresy per se, but rather the Greek word that it comes from, heresia. I think it's fascinating that the word heresy has such strong connotations and so much history connected to it, but the word just means choice. Heresia just means choice. So, if I'm in a bar and I look behind the bar and I see that there are 3 beer taps, that looks like I have a choice to make. I have to look at which 3 brands are available and then choose the one I like, if there is one. And that's my choice. That's my heresy. Now, if this is Austin, 2 of the taps are inevitably going to be IPAs, which is ridiculous. IPAs are nice, don't get me wrong. But, 2 out of 3 taps? Come on, you gotta have a good, clear, clean lager type. And then you've got to have some sort of amber ale. And then, maybe with the 4th tap, you've got a stout. Here's a case of old man shakes fist at clouds. So heresy is simply looking at the options and making a choice. So when it comes to heretical beliefs, bear in mind that the actual content of the belief is not even the real issue. The essential crime that's being committed here is the idea that people can choose what to believe to be true. That is the dissension from God. That is what is antithetical to the Christian worldview. And the whole idea in Orthodox Christianity is that God's message necessarily has to be revealed to humans. It's not something that can just be figured out or understood on its own, just with our own minds looking at the world. God's plan, God's message has some strange features. It has some counterintuitive things. It has ideas that humans don't find all that pleasant. But we're stuck with them because we didn't make the universe. And so, anytime people try to step in and figure out the mystery of God on their own, Orthodox Christian thinkers might become concerned and say, well, that is precisely what Eve did in the garden. She talked to the serpent and started thinking through God's plan on her own and what it meant to her and how she could respond based on what she knew and what she thought might be the best choice. And that happened to differ from what she had been told from God. So, you could argue that the first heresy was Eve's choice to eat the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, simply because she chose to do it. Now, John the Elder, our current author, he himself referred to this mystery of God, meaning the secret information about the cosmos that God has that we don't. And this is something that we can only gather over time in pieces from God. And this is an idea that's been called progressive revelation in the modern period. The idea that God's overall message is too big, too complex for people, and it has to be sort of given in small increments. And this revelation comes primarily through chosen instruments who are these men that are called prophetes, or prophets. So let's hear a little bit about those two prophets that we touched on at the very end of the last volume. These were the two lethal end-time prophets with the superpowers who could breathe fire. So let's hear their introduction again, because we'll be dealing with these two guys in this episode. Let's hear.
And I was given a long cane, like a measuring staff. And he was saying,
"Get up and measure God's temple. And the altar, and the people who worship there. But exclude the outer court of the temple. Do not measure it, because it has been given over to the nations of the earth. They will trample on the holy city for 42 months. And I will send 2 of my witnesses to prophesy for 1,260 days while wearing sackcloth. These are the 2 olive trees and the 2 lampstands that stand before the Lord of the earth. And if anyone wishes to harm them, fire comes out of their mouth. And devours their enemies. So, if anyone wishes to harm them, they must be killed in this way.
Wow. Okay. Note that I have the narrator say, "I was given," but then later we switch tenses and the narrator says, "and he was saying." This reflects what's going on in the original Greek text. There's a definite stream of consciousness style or effect that comes into play in the revelation to John fairly regularly. And this is part of what leads me to think something really happened to John. Now, we have to talk about the nations, the peoples of the earth, the races. John says that the city was going to be given over to tois ethnesin. And this ethnesin is a form of the Greek word ethnos. And that would be transliterated ethnos. Ethnos. And that probably sounds familiar. Ethnos is the Greek word that is the origin of our English words ethnic or ethnicity. It's just an old word for a race or a nation of people. A kind of people. Because remember that the word nation has a strange double meaning in modern English, but it originally came from the Latin word natio, through French, of course. That's how it became nation. But natio refers to someone's birth, just like nativity, or if someone is native born. That nati refers to birth in Latin. And so, what are we talking about? All the nations and races? Do they mean everybody? everyone. Well, kind of. They mean everybody except the Jews. The plural of the Greek word ethnos is ethne. And so the ethne were basically all the people who weren't Jews. Now, ethne is the word that was used in Greek to distinguish Jewish people from non-Jewish people. But you and I are probably much more familiar with an English word that comes from the Latin equivalent of ethne, and that's the word Gentile. I think we've heard this dichotomy between Jews and Gentiles. Well, that G-E-N-T spelling should be a bit of a tip. Gens or gentis in Latin refers to a people or a nation or a race. What do you know? It's basically the Latin equivalent of ethnos. It's where Spanish gets its word gente from. Now, there's a related Latin word, gentilis, G-E-N-T-I-L-I-S, and gentilis means coming from the same race or people, meaning, in a good sense, someone of the right people, not of those people. But the good ones. And thanks to French and further distortion of the meaning in the Middle Ages, we not only get the word Gentile from that, we also get the word genteel, or gentility, or the word gentle and its compound gentleman, which takes on a meaning of being sort of accommodating or gracious or mannered or just nice. But once again, these added meanings and distortions and pronunciation differences can all be blamed fully on the Norman French. Those darn Normans. LeCornu is a Norman French word. I think I've talked about that before. My father and his father and so on are very strictly descended from the Norman French, and I have DNA evidence to prove that. And there was one medieval historian who referred to the Norman French as, quote, glorified thugs. Well, I think that describes me. I think they're onto something. Now, what city does this take place in? What city is being given over to the ethnicene? What city is being trampled by Gentiles? Well, it's being referred to as Tein Polin, the city, Tein Hagian, the Holy One. So, what city is a holy city? The first obvious suspect is going to be Jerusalem. Rome doesn't make sense, because even if we're trying to claim that the Church of Rome has some sort of special place, which is a claim that will be made soon, folks, don't you worry, it hasn't been made quite yet. And in any sense that you can think of, Rome has already long been trampled over by non-Jews. As far as I can tell, most biblical scholars at some point throw up their hands and say, I think he's talking about Jerusalem. There are several reasons for that. The reference to the temple, the bringing up this distinction between Jews and Gentiles, referring to it as the holy city before Catholicism took root. There aren't a whole lot of cities that can check those boxes. That also leads us to the fact that John specifies a very specific time period for how long this city would be exploited or desecrated or just maybe overcrowded by the Gentiles, by the ethne. And it's about 3.5 years. or 42 months. Another thing that's interesting is John specifically says that these two fire-breathing prophets will be wearing sackcloth. There's our sackcloth again. In the first volume, you may recall that John the Elder and I had a bit of an unpleasant verbal exchange where he sort of corrected the fact that he thought I was making fun of sackcloth and the tradition of wearing these messy, uncomfortable shirts made of animal hair for ceremonial purposes. But here's an example of the fact that it happened a lot, and it was mentioned a lot in the ancient world. In particular, I can think of a situation where one of my heroes, Alexander the Great, wore sackcloth and cut his hair and covered his face in ashes. In other words, he went full sackcloth. Everybody knows you never go full sackcloth. Alexander had kind of a drinking problem, and on more than one occasion, Alexander had to wear sackcloth and cover his face in ashes to express his humility and mourning and contrition for something terrible that he did the night before when he was drunk. This includes killing officers in drunken fights over relatively minor issues, or burning down the city of Persepolis in what is now Iran. Alexander had pledged to leave the city alone. And he normally did. That's one thing I liked about Alexander. He was a builder, not a destroyer. Alexander liked to build new cities or add to cities rather than burn them down. And if you played ball with him, he'd play ball with you. But one night, after they had conquered Persepolis, which was at the time the capital of the Persian Empire, Alexander had pledged to leave it alone, but one of his generals had a hetaira, which we have talked about, basically a socially high-ranking professional girlfriend to the elite, and she happened to be Athenian, like a lot of the best hetairae were, because they were seen as more cultured. And so this rough Macedonian horseman general guy was getting drunk with his girlfriend, and the rest of them had theirs. And of course, Alexander did not have a girlfriend. Alexander was definitely of the opinion that girls were icky. That's why his empire fell apart so quickly, because basically his generals fought to divide up what was left. Because Alexander refused to pinch his nose and close his eyes and create an heir for his empire. Didn't do that. He was very hung up on this one guy, Hephaestion, whom he saw as the love of his life. Anyway, during this party in Persepolis, the Athenian girlfriend really started talking about how the Greeks owe the Persians for what they did to Athens in the early 5th century BC, more than 100 years before. This lady's grandparents weren't even around when the Persians burned Athens to the ground, but they did do that. And so she was saying, hey, here's our chance for the Greek-speaking people to strike back, to burn their capital city to the ground.
I fucking hate Persians so much, guys. Like, dead ass. I'm serious.
Now, I'm not sure why this swayed Alexander all that much, because he had to fight to put down a revolt of Athenians against his control over southern Greece. So her speaking so highly of Athens as some sort of central city of Greek-speaking civilization that deserves some sort of vengeance probably didn't sit well entirely with him politically. But as far as we can tell, these drunken Macedonians were inspired by her words.
We're gonna toss some torches up in this bitch. Burn this fucker down.
And when they woke up the next morning, Persepolis had been burned to the ground. And so now it's time for Alexander to put the hair shirt on and get out in front of the army with his face covered in ashes and cry and talk about how regretful he is. And this happened multiple times. I know that's a strange comparison to what these prophets are doing. Wearing a hair shirt to apologize for murdering an acquaintance or for burning down a city seems like a strange pairing with these two serious prophets of God, or even with John he who yells in the hallway. I say this because I want people to know that this wearing of sackcloth is a culturally important thing, not just among people in the Abrahamic tradition. This also brings up a chronology issue, because I just said sackcloth is super common in the Greco-Roman world of John's time. By the modern period, it's barely a thing, except maybe in monasteries. And so it seems unlikely that we'll have a future where political or religious figures will wear sackcloth on TV or on the internet. That's not the only strange thing about these people. I mean, of course, they can breathe fire. And we're going to find out that they have even more superpowers. They can do a couple of things that are very impressive and that will make the world hate them, but also fear them. So let's listen.
These beings have the power to lock the heavens. So that no rain falls on the days of their prophecy. And they have the power to turn water into blood and attack the earth with every disaster whenever they want. And when they are finished with their witnessing, the beast that comes out of the abyss will make war against them. And he will conquer them and kill them. And their bodies lay on the street of the great city, which is called Sodom and Egypt in spirit, where their Lord was crucified. And people from every race and tribe and language and nation will look at their corpses for 3.5 days. And they will not let their bodies be buried in a tomb. the inhabitants of the earth are rejoicing about it. And they're celebrating. And they will send each other gifts. Because these two prophets tormented the inhabitants of the earth.
Oh boy. Does this mean that the Bible says that there will be people in the future who can control the weather? Yes, it does. And that's every conspiracy theorist's dream. There's all kinds of conspiracies related to controlling the weather. This immediately brings to mind projects like HAARP, HAARP, and there are generally two ways that people suggest that the weather is being controlled. One is through the spraying or diffusion of certain kinds of particles in the upper atmosphere, and doing things like cloud seeding is a real thing. And the idea of using reflective particles in the atmosphere to reflect sunlight back out into space is something that's scientifically sound and not only has been done artificially, but it's something that's being studied as a natural phenomenon because there are pollutants that humans produced in the 20th century that created these tiny reflective particles that actually have been masking some climate change effects, because they can actually keep the Earth's temperature from rising too much because they reflect a lot of the sun's solar radiation back out into space before it's trapped under a layer of greenhouse gases. Another way of controlling the weather is through the intensive use of radio waves. And there are actual facilities that have been built to study this effect. And some people say that these facilities have actually achieved weather control at some point. But that's going to be a subject for another episode. What's more apropos here is this mention of Toterion. Toterion is the beast. And here we have the beast coming out of the abyss. And this is part of why the Emperor of the Abyss, the being who led the torture monsters, was associated with the beast. This is the same Greek word, toterion, that's used to describe the being who will be assigned a special number soon. The number 666. Which, by the way, we tend to use the iconography and the shorthand of the three numeral sixes.
666.
But we have to remember that these Arabic numerals were not used at the time, and it's more of a convenience. The number is expressed verbally in the actual book. And so note that in the text of the Revelation to John, it's presented as a total, or a sum of something. And so that's why I say 666 instead of 666. Because expressing it as a number that is the total of something, as we'll see in later episodes, is going to be more appropriate. John says that this all happens in the holy city, and it's the holy city that is called Pneumatikos Sodoma kai Aiguptos. So, Pneumatikos would be transliterated Pneumatikos. So, the Pneu, there we go again. So, it's really saying that the city is known pneumatically as Sodom and Egypt. Sodoma kai Aiguptos. Now, what do we mean by pneumatically? Kind of like a pneumatic tire. This, of course, refers to spiritually. So in spirit, this city is Sodom and Egypt. Now, these are two interesting choices of cities to talk about. So when he says that that's what this city is in spirit, he's helping us out here because he's saying, well, it's not Sodom, which doesn't exist anymore. Sodom was destroyed at the end of the Bronze Age. And Egypt is not really a city. It's a whole region. But in John's time, the primary city in Egypt would have been Alexandria. And note, there were far more Jews living in Alexandria than were living in Jerusalem at the time. Because remember, one generation before, Jerusalem had been completely leveled, and the Jewish diaspora had started in earnest. But one thing that both Sodom and Alexandria have in common is people who should know better doing bad, degenerate stuff. Basically, turning from God when they had the opportunity to turn toward him. Now, Alexandria eventually would just become submerged under the Mediterranean. Only the Harvard Archaeology Department can afford to excavate there. Sodom is a different story. Its ruins are still around. We know where to dig if you want to find a layer of ash that you can point to and say, well, there's Sodom. We talked about Sodom earlier in my Killed by Aliens series. In particular, we talked about how angels entered Sodom shortly before the destruction, and they gave warnings. The angels even helped Lot's family leave the city before a hail of fire from the heavens leveled the city. And there was the unfortunate incident where Lot's wife was converted into a pillar of salt for looking back at the city. And you know what? Let's revisit that. I have that sound clip, so let's listen to the destruction of Sodom, just for old time's sake.
When dawn broke, the angels urged Lot on. "To your feet, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city." Then Yahweh rained down on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire of his own sending. He overthrew those cities and the whole plain, with all the people living in the cities, and everything that grew there. But Lot's wife looked back and was turned into a pillar of salt. The next morning, Abraham hurried to the place where he had stood before Yahweh, and looking towards Sodom and Gomorrah and the whole area of the plain, he saw the smoke rising from the ground like smoke from a furnace.
Well, that was weird. But back to the holy city, where our 2 prophets are. We have very little choice but to assume that this place is Jerusalem, because John says that this city is Hopu kai hokurios auton estaurote. Now, stauroo is the verb for crucifixion. And so, Kurios is the Lord, Auton, their Lord, and it's referring to the 2 prophets who are described as being prophets of God. And then it says, Estaurote, which would be where their Lord was crucified. So it appears that their Lord is Jesus, and we're talking about Jerusalem here. There were other famous people who were crucified, but we're running out of options. I don't think John the Elder is talking about Spartacus being crucified in Sicily. I doubt he's referencing that here. So what that means is this is a good example of the low opinion that many Christians in John's time, i.e., in the late 1st century AD, had about Jerusalem. They didn't think much of Jerusalem. As I said earlier, Jerusalem is still in ruins and being rebuilt and resettled during John's time. It was completely destroyed in 70 AD, about 25 years earlier. And so a lot of this leads me to think that it's almost certain that, at least in terms of John's vision, he believes he's seeing something that's occurring in the future, despite the sackcloth. There are multiple things that indicate the future to me, meaning John's future, i.e., perhaps our present or very, very near future. And one of those things that indicates our near future is this ability to control the weather, but also something that's being referenced indirectly a couple of times here in this chapter. And that's this ability for the world to see things all at the same time. So far, the whole world saw their death. The whole world saw their bodies on the street of the holy city. And then the whole world was able to celebrate their deaths all around the world. That sounds like a global culture. That sounds a lot like our time. There have been lots of events where millions of people saw it live happen all around the world. Or very quickly, videos of something was shared on X or TikTok. So I find it weird that John repeatedly sees a world where things can be seen instantaneously by large numbers of people at huge distances. And he's definitely writing in a pre-modern time, before mass media, before electronic communication, before satellites, before TV, before TikTok. So I find that interesting. Another thing I find interesting is, again, John is slipping up with his tenses when he's writing his Greek. Now, is this just sloppy writing? Is it more evidence that his native language was not actually ancient Greek, as some people have suggested? That would be weird because, as we'll see in the next episode with our discussion of dragons, it appears that John was familiar with the Greek translation of the Old Testament. And if someone was more comfortable reading Hebrew, then it would be strange that he would copy phrasing from that source and not from the Hebrew or Aramaic sources that were available to him. For example, John suddenly switches and says, "And they are rejoicing," in the present tense, like he's seeing it in his mind's eye. It makes it a lot more immediate. It's also interesting to see happy people in John's vision. He hasn't seen a lot of happy people so far. So, good for him. A little moment of positivity. Even though it's people celebrating the death of two prophets of God, there had to be some sort of dark element to it, right? This is the revelation to John, after all. We know that this rejoicing is not going to last long. So we've got two dead prophets, their corpses laid out in the street, and the world is denying them burial. The whole world is wanting to see their corpses just rot in front of everyone. And, again, this implies some sort of era of mass communication. The whole world is watching. Let's see. Now that the whole world is watching live, I wonder what's going to happen next. Let's hear.
And after those 3.5 days, the breath of life came into them from God, and they stood up on their feet. And a great fear fell upon the people who were watching them. I heard a loud voice from the sky saying to them,
"Come up here."
And they went up into the heavens in a cloud, as their enemies watched them. In that same hour, there was a huge earthquake. And 1/10 of the city fell down. The earthquake killed 7,000 people. The survivors were terrified, and they praised the God of heaven. The second disaster has passed. Look, the third disaster is coming quickly.
Well, that was a little bit unexpected, but come on. I think we all expected something like that to happen. And I think it's fascinating because this whole situation doesn't work unless you're in a live TV, around the world kind of situation. Now that I think about it, in our current situation, if I were to see some famous person, like one of these prophets, come back to life and stand up after being killed in whatever way they were killed by the Emperor of the Abyss, by the Beast, I would definitely think that someone might be using AI videos to trick me. Well, this is where we'll leave it for now until the next episode on the Revelation to John, where we'll talk about beasts and dragons and strange celestial women and their divine children. But more on that later. But it's hard not to think about the impact of AI and the possible apocalypse awaiting us in terms of our financial situation, in terms of extremely high unemployment. I'm seeing massive waves of record layoffs, and it's concerning. It's interesting to consider that AI is almost certainly a complication that John the Elder did not consider. I don't think he was worried about AI as he was deep in prayer on the island of Patmos. Now, knowledge of AI is one advantage that we have over John. Another advantage that we might have is just having seen all the post-apocalyptic movies that we've seen. John the Elder never saw Mad Max. He never saw The Road Warrior. Fortunately for him, he never saw Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome. And unfortunately, he missed out completely on Mad Max Fury Road. But one thing that these movies have taught us is that if our civilization falls and our economy crashes and we return to subsistence living and raiding and bartering, and we end up living just like in the Mad Max movies, like I'll have to deal with looking like Tom Hardy in a black leather jacket when it's 120 degrees. I'll have to figure out how to live life like that. My wife will be driving an armored 18-wheeler truck. She's missing an arm, paints her face a lot of black face paint around the eyes, and it's getting dangerously close to having a kind of blackface effect. Not really what you want to go for. But if we are in that situation and our civilization has fallen, I can see 3 big advantages. First, we can just make some weird, unjustified fashion choices. And apparently no one's gonna say anything. Like, I can wear old running shoes on my shoulders, like they're shoulder pads. And I'm bald now, but when the crash happens, I'm gonna wear a little plastic broom brush on my head like a mohawk. A big plastic yellow mohawk. And it's gonna be somehow glued perfectly perpendicular right down the middle of my head. Like John's eagle flying along the midline of the heavens. Now, the second bonus of living through a civilizational collapse is that we can all start using silly Australian-sounding slang nicknames for everything. Why, I'm still gonna be casting me pod, if you know what I mean. Gonna be professor in the old good book, they say. End of the world talk, they say. See, it's fun. And the third and biggest advantage is something that we learn from every post-apocalyptic movie, and that is, the rule is that after the world ends, after the apocalypse happens, you get to change your name. You can even add silly titles if you have enough henchmen with guns. All of you know that I want to be known as the Ayatollah of Rock'n'Rolla. Lord Humongous beat me to it in The Road Warrior. I'm not going to go so far as to change my name to Lord Humongous. I'm, to some extent, as an American, I'm anti-monarchist, so I wouldn't want to use the word Lord because it would imply that I'm trying to rely on some sort of inherited title. When it's the end of the world, you know, this is where you build new dynasties. So, Mad Max did it right. I don't think he came up with that name. That was a nickname that his colleagues gave him before everything fell apart. But he did it right. Mad Max is a pretty cool, quick, simple, evocative nickname. We find out that his name before the end of the world was Maximilian Rockatansky. I mean, that's still a pretty cool name. It's just too long. Too long. That's the issue. 2 syllables. Mad Max. Boom, boom. All done. That's how you do it. So I'm not sure what my post-apocalyptic name will be, but in the movie Mad Max Fury Road, there was a guy who ran a facility where they gathered spent bullets and they cleaned them and sorted them and measured them, and then they used crude methods to remake new cartridges and, of course, sell them or hand them over to local warlords for favors. And they called that guy the Bullet Farmer. So, I guess I'll be known as the Conspiracy Farmer. And that's an apt title for me because in the next episode, I've got a bumper crop of conspiracies ready to go. We'll revisit Revelation, and we'll be talking about dragons, and the Ice Age, and China, and Satan, and a gigantic 7-headed fire-red star-destroying dragon that might be Satan. And so until then, talk to you later.